Biden is hosting, which had been dominated already with doubts about his health and fears about his possible successor. Sir Keir Starmer says Joe Biden is in good form. His Danish counterpart tells me tonight he's in good shape. What else could they say, you might think? That is not the opinion of many of those far closer to the president, it now seems. And on the eve of the summit, Donald Trump again threatened to tear up the founding principle of the alliance, one for all and all for one. His team is also telling journalists his plan for Ukraine would include letting Russia keep some of the land it's taken by force. So where does this leave America? Where does it leave its allies at such a crucial moment in world affairs? There's only one place to start tonight. Let's go live to Washington, where our US correspondent Mark Stone is at the NATO summit. Mark, quite a scoop from NBC News. What do you make of it?
Quite a scoop. Hard to know where to begin. What a week this could turn out to be, Dom. An extraordinary week. Certainly extraordinary pressure for President Biden, the president who has been hosting such a crucial summit here in Washington, described at the beginning of the week as the biggest summit of its kind in 3 decades. The focus has been, they hoped, on Ukraine, on NATO, on the stability of NATO, on its ability to fight back against Russia in Ukraine. But instead, the focus has been on the host, on President Biden, and this extraordinary pressure that continues to build since that disastrous debate back 2 weeks ago. And from all corners now, the vibe seems to be one of endgame. There is this news conference in about a couple of hours' time here. The latest huge test for President Biden, a news conference, a rare one. He so rarely does them. Tonight he will, and tonight we will see how he performs. You mentioned the latest NBC report. I mean, it's not only NBC. All the news organizations are getting leaks from sources close to the Biden campaign, from senators on Capitol Hill, from congressmen and women as well, who many of them not willing to be named, but many of them deeply worried about President Biden, about his ability to beat Donald Trump. And to NBC, several of President Biden's closest allies, including 3 people, Dom, who are directly involved in efforts to re-elect him, have told NBC that they see his chances of winning as 0. He needs to drop out. That is a quote from one campaign official. He will never recover from this. Extraordinary stuff as President Biden fights for his political life.
I mean, it might be too early. I don't know whether you think it is or not to say it's just a question of time now, Mark. But if he is looking for a time, on Monday he goes to Austin in Texas, where he'll give an address, long pre-scheduled, at the LBJ Library. Lyndon Baines Johnson, of course, the president who decided he wouldn't run for a re-election and stunned the world when he announced that. That would be a fitting time and place for him to do it. Do you think this is a president now thinking about that, or is he still in denial about what everyone else, well, more and more people around him are saying about him?
The key question, Dom, is what his inner circle are thinking. And by his inner circle, I'm talking about his wife, the First Lady, Jill Biden, his sister, Valerie, his son, Hunter, who has, over the course of the past week, we're told, been heavily involved in the thinking and the crisis talks that must be going on within the White House. On the face of it, it is business as usual. At the beginning of the week, President Biden sent a 2-page letter to lawmakers on his own side on Capitol Hill, an attempt after a not-so-good interview with ABC News late last week, an attempt to shore up the dam, to assure them that he is capable of beating Donald Trump, that he is the candidate. He even seemed to pick a fight with the elites, as he called them, pointing out that the people of America, he believes, want him to be the candidate, that in the primaries across the country a few months ago, he was the chosen one, he was the candidate. But as George Clooney, the actor and mega donor, said just yesterday in that devastating New York Times opinion piece, that was the view then, but things have changed. So says George Clooney. Things being that disastrous debate. And George Clooney was quite clear that the The Biden he saw in the debate 2 weeks ago was the same Biden that he stood alongside at a massive campaign event in Los Angeles. At the time when the US media, the right-wing media mostly, pointed out that Biden looked lost and frail in that Los Angeles fundraiser, they were chastised by the White House. How dare you have these cheap shots against President Biden, so the White House said. Well, just a week or two later, one of the key figures at that campaign event, George Clooney, said, you know what, they were right. He was frail then, he was frail at the debate 2 weeks ago, and in the words of George Clooney, we will lose the election under Joe Biden, a man he describes as a friend. We will lose the House, we will lose the Senate. Devastating stuff, and to come on a week like this, remarkable indeed.
And Mark, while we're talking about Donald Trump, he has been kind of overshadowing the NATO summit, or certainly talking about NATO, repeating what he said a while ago, which caused such controversy. We'll have a talk about it in a minute, but let's have a listen to Donald Trump here. It seems to sound like he's undermining that central pillar of NATO, one for all and all for one. Let's have a listen.
Somebody stood up from one of the countries, 28 countries, and only 7 were paying what they should be paying. 28 countries, think of that. And these countries, now we added a couple, but 28 countries. And they said, sir, could I ask you, I said, you have to pay your bills. They said, sir, may I ask you a question? If we don't pay our bills, will you protect us from Russia? I said, you mean you're delinquent? They said, yes, we're delinquent. Let's say we're delinquent. Would you protect us? I said, no, I will not protect you from Russia.
So, Mark, how is that going down where you are amongst those allies? And how do they feel, do you think, tonight about what appears to be happening to the leader that many of them, I think, probably would prefer to see as leader of the free world and not that man there who doesn't seem to believe in one of the fundamental principles of NATO?
Well, a few things to unpick. First of all, that anecdote that Donald Trump just gave that you heard there, it's one he's used before. The Trump on the campaign trail is a Trump full of rhetoric, as always. We know that he continually has undermined NATO, that he has talked about pulling out of NATO, that he's questioned the principle of Article 5, that is an attack on one is an attack on all. An article, incidentally, that's only ever been invoked to help the United States after 9/11. The question, to answer your question, what are people thinking here? Well, clearly, naturally, behind the scenes, and diplomats have told me as much, that the leaders are looking over President Biden's shoulder towards November, towards what a second Trump presidency could look like. Now, that raises a couple of other questions. To what extent is Trump's rhetoric, to what extent will the reality of a second Trump term match the rhetoric? Well, if you talk to Trump insiders, they are more nuanced. And I think among diplomats, there are two views. There are those, of course, who have an existentialist view of what a second Trump term would look like. It is clearly true that Europe on NATO needs to do more heavy lifting. That's already happening. But under a second Trump term, it would be much more dramatic. It would be much more brutal. The European nations would have to do much more heavy lifting. There are those diplomats, though, who believe that perhaps a second Trump term would not be quite as disastrous, that yes, domestically it would splinter the United States domestically, certainly, but internationally, Trump is a pragmatist. He is someone who wants to be a winner. He's not going to want to burn the global house down. So two very different views there, but undoubtedly there is much anxiety, and as they see weakness in Biden, they wonder more and more what Trump might look like.
Mark Stone in Washington at the NATO summit, thank you very much. Let's get more reaction to tonight's moving story. I'm joined now by Democratic strategist Nicole Berner-Schmitz, who has previously worked with the Vice President Kamala Harris. Nicole, thank you very much for joining us tonight. What is your reaction to this story, not just from NBC, but as Mark was saying there, more and more people saying publicly and also privately that the president really has to stand down. He doesn't have a chance of winning a re-election. It's time he stood aside and let someone else take up the reins.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, this continues to be a drip, drip, drip. It's a senator here, it's a couple members of Congress, and then it feels like the tide's turning, and now it's started again. So it continues to be that a conversation about should Biden stay in this race. He's adamant that he is. a trickling of people saying that he shouldn't between electeds and donors, and no one, unfortunately, talking about all of the lies and the Project 2025 that Trump has been putting out there into the atmosphere.
So your old boss, Kamala Harris, is she tonight now planning, do you think, to run instead of the president, who everyone, or so many more people have been saying now this week, after last week and the week before, should stand aside? Do you think she's preparing for her time in office now, or trying to prepare for re-election possibly?
I mean, look, the vice president has been very clear that she stands with the president, that they are a ticket right now. She has publicly done nothing to splinter that. There are rumors that some people in the orbit are having some separate conversations, but right now she is firmly with the president, and they are a ticket that's running. Biden's going to have a press conference tonight. I think this is a very big press conference. It's going to be unscripted. He's going to take active questions. I think a lot rests with how does this press conference go and what is America's reaction to this. And by America, I don't mean the talking heads such as myself on TV and some pundits and some big donors, but where are the voters in the states? How are people feeling, and what do they think is the best path forward for this country?
Well, those campaign officials that NBC is quoting in that explosive piece there, who are close to the president, they're inside their campaign. They say that he has no chance, zero chance of coming back from this. Surely they're more important at this stage than the talking heads, but also the voters. I mean, is that not the point? If his own campaign doesn't believe he has a chance of re-election, it is time now for him to go.
Yeah, I mean, if you're not surrounded by people who believe that you can win and that there's a path forward, that is certainly problematic. But,
Sure.
you know, President Biden has come from a place where he feels like he's been this person before. He feels like he's been running for president since the 80s. And even as recently as the 2020 primaries, he was counted down and out and was not going to be our nominee. So I think there's a lot of, I mean, I don't pretend to know what's going on in the president's head, but it does seem that mind frame and that place of they count me out, but they don't know, is factoring in here. And there's really a lot of people on the campaign, but only a very, very small number that he really trusts and is fully listening to.
Nicole Berner-Schmitz, thank you very much for your insights into that breaking story out of Washington. So questions over the president's health overshadowing what could be the most pivotal NATO summit in decades. Sir Keir Starmer told Sky News Mr Biden was on form. He was speaking to our political editor, Beth Rigby.
Day 2 on the world stage for Sir Keir Starmer, starting with a visit to Arlington Cemetery. And another reminder of the instability of the era he now presides over. Visiting this memorial to conflicts of the past, doing diplomacy with counterparts to shore up stability for the future. Hello, Prime Minister.
How are you?
Having been at the right-hand side of the US President just yesterday, I asked the Prime Minister to address the questions of Joe Biden's suitability to lead.
I spent time with him yesterday. We were billed for a 45-minute bilateral. It was best part of an hour by the time we'd finished. We covered a lot of ground, strategic ground, stuff that I particularly wanted to raise. We did it at pace. He was on good form. And I was very pleased that we were able to cover that amount of ground.
So you think that criticism is misguided?
Well, he was on good form with me and we were covering
it's misguided.
really important... Yes.
This summit's focus on Ukraine and questions for the PM on putting his money where his mouth is.
So what I want to do is make the commitment, be absolutely clear how we reach that commitment, and that it's within our fiscal rules. That actually is a more serious commitment than being arbitrary.
Let me put it another way then. I understand what you're saying. Is it your ambition as Prime Minister to achieve that target in your first term in office?
I'm not going to put a date on it because it's going to be within our fiscal rules.
So you're not putting the money where your mouth is?
Look, I'm being serious about how we meet that 2.5%.
In a week of political firsts, there was a personal reflection too, for a Prime Minister who often talked about his parents on the campaign trail. You said at the time of the Platinum Jubilee, it was the proudest day of your parents' lives to go to Buckingham Palace and to see you receive a knighthood. What do you think they would have made of seeing you, their son, walking through the door of Downing Street as Prime Minister?
Oh, they'd have loved that. And there's a real part of me that just wishes that they could have been there, because that would have been very special for them. Obviously, they're not with us anymore. They won't have that moment. But I can't pretend to you that I haven't thought about that.
Was it a bit bittersweet then?
Not bittersweet, but, you know, I would have loved them to have been there, and they weren't there. And Vic obviously lost her mum in the Labour leadership contest, so both of us had a thought and a discussion about that. We would have loved our parents to have been there. They weren't, but we smile because we know what they would have thought had they been there.
As Keir Starmer settles in and makes friends, this is perhaps the last foreign trip he'll make without political baggage. It will only get harder when he returns home. Beth Rigby, Sky News, Washington.
So lots of talk then about funding at this NATO summit, about who's meeting targets, who's providing what to Ukraine and how much of it. NATO allies have pledged at least €40 billion in military aid within the next year. The UK has promised $3 billion, with Sir Keir Starmer vowing to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. Britain has also granted Ukraine permission to use its Storm Shadow missiles to hit targets inside Russia. It's been announced that long-range US cruise missiles, including the Tomahawk cruise, SM-6 and hypersonic missiles, will be deployed periodically in Germany from 2026 for the first time since the Cold War. Russia has said there will be a military response to that new threat. There's been a key focus on boosting Ukraine's air defences. The Netherlands, Norway and Denmark are transferring the first batch of US-made F-16 fighter jets. Denmark has committed 19 in total, while the Netherlands has promised 24. Another 5 new air defence systems are being sent. The US will give an additional Patriot air defence system, so too Germany and Romania. And the Netherlands is supplying a Patriot system made up of components donated by other countries. Italy has said it will provide a SAMP-T air defence system. Denmark is one of 7 NATO members ahead of the UK when it comes to defence spending. It spends 2.37% of its GDP, and as we've been hearing, they have pledged more than a dozen F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. Amid concerns about the future funding of the alliance, I asked the country's Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, whether she was concerned.
I think the most important thing is, of course, our unity, transatlantic, between Europe and US and Canada. And then secondly, the war in Ukraine. And I'm not allowed to correct you, but I don't think we should talk about Putin. I think we have to talk about Russia. And I think we have to recognize that this is not primarily a question about Putin and Ukraine. This is a question about Russia that has attacked a European country. We are in the middle of a full-scale war. And we have to do whatever is needed to push the Russians back. And this is one of the main messages from Denmark in this discussion.
And yet there is a lot of discussion, as you say, on the sidelines. There is a lot of talk on the sidelines of this summit, but also sort of dominating the coverage about Joe Biden, the current American president, and also Donald Trump, the previous one, and likely to be the next president if you look at opinion polls. Talking about Donald Trump first, the reports are that in negotiations, if he gets into the White House, he could allow Vladimir Putin to keep parts of Ukraine that he's taken by force and also commit to NATO not expanding further eastwards. Would both of those things, do you think, be a mistake if Donald Trump were to become president again?
Well, first of all, I think we have to handle the situation on the battlefield and the situation that we are seeing in Europe. I think there are too many ifs in the different discussions. And no matter what will happen in the US after the elections in November, I think we have a lot of homework to do in Europe. Because now different American presidents have been putting the same message on the table. You have to be able to do more. You have to take care of your own security. You have to bring bigger commitments. You have to do more as Europeans. And I have to say, I agree with them. So I'm not spending my time in thinking about what will happen. I'm trying to handle the situation as it is on the battlefield and as it is in Europe. And I'm really proud of everything we have done for now 2.5 years, transatlantic, to help Ukraine, but it's simply not enough. And I think that's the most important discussion, how to help Ukraine more, to speed up and to scale up, and at the same time do our own homework in Europe so we will face all the challenges in front of us in a better way than we do today.
But you should be thinking about what might happen, shouldn't you? Shouldn't that be your duty, to think about the possibility of an American president coming in who doesn't seem as committed to NATO as the current president, who seems to be prepared to give Vladimir Putin at least some of the parts of Ukraine he's taken, and who would, it seems, commit to NATO not expanding further eastward? Shouldn't that be something you should be preoccupied about?
Yes, but at the same time, it is a domestic affair in U.S. who the Americans want as the next president, and it's our duty as Europeans to be able to work together. I have tried to work with President Trump. I'm working closely together now with President Biden. And what I'm trying to say is that no matter what happens in the US, we still have a lot of obligations in Europe. No matter what will happen in the US, I think there is a lot of homework to be done in Europe, and that's what I'm trying to focus on. And at the same time, to give Ukraine what they need. And there are still things to be done in Ukraine because the situation on the battlefield is terrible. Look what Russia are doing in these days. I mean, attacking directly into Kiev. Killing innocent people. So our main focus should be air defense, to provide Ukraine with the ammunition, the weapons, including the Danish F-16s fighter jets. I think that should be the main focus.
Well, and Denmark is giving at least 60 F-16 fighter jets, and Ukraine already has around 70. Russia has over 800 fighter jets and warplanes. What possible difference could giving 65 to Ukraine make with that massive, overwhelming advantage the Russians have in the air and the skies over Ukraine, potentially?
Giving our a lot of our F-16s will, of course, make a difference. But you are totally right. We need more. From a Danish perspective, we have been saying the same now for 2.5 years. All weapons are better used in Ukraine than in our own countries. When it comes to air defense, I would rather see the Western Patriot systems in Ukraine than in the western part of NATO, because it's better used there. If all allies goes to this object with the same will, of course, then we will be able to help Ukraine more. Our own security starts in Ukraine. This is not a matter about Ukraine. Ukraine is a part of Europe.
What you seem to be saying is that if Donald Trump does get into the White House and America does retreat to some extent from NATO, your European partners are not doing enough to fill that potential vacuum.
But we have to, and once again, and I'm a little bit tired of repeating myself.
Yeah, but are you saying they're not doing enough now? They're not doing enough to fill that vacuum. Your partners in Europe.
No, but we can do if we want to. And I don't see an alternative of speeding up and scaling up. And I don't, to be very honest with you, I don't see an alternative to Ukraine winning this war. Because if we allow Russia to define the borders in Europe, then we give in on everything we have worked for since the end of the Second World War. So we have to stick to the strategy to help Ukraine as long as it takes, with what it takes.
What is the end game here, Prime Minister? Is it forcing Russia completely out of Ukraine, or is it accepting that at some point there will have to be negotiations, but hopefully from a position where Ukraine can negotiate with NATO countries backing it from a position of strength?
For me, the end game is peace and prosperity and freedom in Europe. And it's only up to Ukraine to define what that means for Ukraine. And when countries says, well, let's just give Putin some part of the country, I think they should ask themselves, would they think about their own country in that way? I can say from a Danish perspective that if we were attacked by Russia and Putin, I would never allow him to take a part of Denmark.
A lot of the coverage of this summit has not been about the alliance. It's been about the state of the President of America. Joe Biden hosted you in Washington a year or so ago, so you've had a chance to see if he has changed. To your mind, is he in some kind of decline? Is he clearly not as well as he was a year ago, would you say?
I have a good cooperation with President Biden, and I have to say, I think the only one who is really happy about all these discussions about European and American leaders are probably Putin. I think we should focus much more on the war and all the challenges in front of our alliance. I consider the question about President Biden as an internal American issue. I can say from a Danish perspective, we have a good cooperation with the president, and I think he has been and he is a good leader of NATO.
So you're not directly answering the question there. I mean, you're not saying that he is as well as he was a year ago, and it isn't just an internal American question, is it? It's surely.
No, you cannot conclude that out of what I said. I look at as president who is in a good shape. I trust him. He's a good ally, and I think he's a good leader. And I'm not going into any discussions about any of my colleagues from any country.
Well, Mette Frederiksen, the Prime Minister of Denmark there. Coming on air, since we come on air, we've just heard another Democratic representative call for Joe Biden to quit. That is Greg Stanton of Arizona, who is more concerned about his president's health, it seems, than the Prime Minister of Denmark there. Tonight, our colleagues, NBC News, are reporting that the president's own allies and officials want him to quit from within the campaign team. Jonathan Allen, senior politics reporter for NBC News, has that story. Jonathan, thanks for joining us tonight. Congratulations on that scoop. The Biden campaign officials you're talking about there, are they outliers within the campaign, or are they sort of broadly speaking representing the majority of sentiment now inside the Biden campaign team that the president should not run for re-election?
That's a great question, Dominic. I can't speak to whether it's a majority or not, but I'm told by our sources that it is a widespread sentiment among those who are, experienced in politics, those who have been around the block, those who have access to a lot of information. That basically, what we've heard from people who are supporting this campaign effort is that they're starting to believe that he has no path to win against Trump. There are a lot of things that go into that calculation. It's not just polling, although that'll have something to do with it. It's what they saw in the debate. It's their concern that this will be the discussion going forward every time Joe Biden is in public. Whether he is able to, not just be a candidate for the next 4 years, but to continue to execute the job. They are concerned, of course, that their fundraising is drying up. George Clooney, the famous actor, I'm sure, on both sides of the pond, with basically urging Biden to get out after being one of his big donors. There's a lot of concern about what the effect will be, not just at the presidential level, but in the lower races for Congress.
Jonathan, we're having trouble getting a picture of you as you talk, getting vision of you talking, but we can, I think, read through that tweet from Greg Stanton that we've got on the screen, where he says, and this is a congressman from Arizona saying, I was one of President Biden's earliest supporters in 2020. I'm proud of the progress we've made for Arizona. However, the stakes in this election could not be higher. For our country's sake, he says, it is time for the president to pass the torch to a new generation of leaders. And I think the suspicion, of course, is that there are more to come, and probably many of his colleagues, of Mr. Stanton's colleagues and others, would have preferred not to say anything like this until the summit was over, to sort of give a bit of room for this NATO summit, this crucial, very historic summit to happen. Do you think, Jonathan, that we'll hear from a lot more once that summit is done?
I think most of the Democratic members of Congress are hoping that Joe Biden will come to a conclusion on his own, that he should step aside. They don't want to be out there. It is politically dangerous for them. He has a base of supporters who may take out their vengeance on these members of Congress. So there's some danger in that. They don't want to embarrass Biden by coming out and publicly calling for him to step aside. And I think that's one of the reasons you see some of the Democratic leaders, Nancy Pelosi, the former Speaker of the House, every time Joe Biden says he made a decision to stay in the race, she comes out and says, I'm waiting for him to make his decision, right? So she's going out there and effectively telling people that he still has an opportunity to get out, and I think that's providing some cover for some of her fellow Democrats in Congress.
And, I mean, we are increasingly getting the impression that it's just a matter of time before President Biden does what many now believe is the inevitable, even if he doesn't in his own mind at the moment. In terms of a time, I was discussing with Mark Stone at the start of the programme, he does give this sort of keynote, very important address on Monday at LBJ, President Lyndon Baines Johnson's library in Austin, Texas. Now, if he's looking for a place at a time, that could be a place and a time where he could choose to stand down in his re-election hopes and campaign, because, of course, LBJ himself stunned the world in 1968 when he announced that he wasn't going to run for re-election himself. And of course, what followed that was chaos within the Democratic Party. And the fear is that if Joe Biden does what his campaign officials, you're quoting as saying, and many more people around him seem to be saying, stand down, then we could see the party descend into chaos. Do you think there is a natural successor to him, or is it just going to lead to an enormous amount of feuding within the party, which will then leave them exposed to an inevitable Trump victory in November?
It's hard to predict exactly what would happen, in the absence of watching it. However, there is a natural successor. Joe Biden told the American public in 2020 that Kamala Harris, his vice president, was the next best person to be president of the United States. And as a result, she is the natural successor to Biden. If he were to, for instance, resign the presidency, she would become president. I also believe that, in talking to Democratic members of Congress, Democratic state party chairs, other operatives, I think there's a consensus that they would move to Harris because it is the cleanest, most natural succession, and they would not want a chaotic post-Biden exit period, right? So they want to see something that's smoother. The smoothest thing they could do would be to go to Harris.
Well, I guess people watching on this side of the Atlantic who are terrified at the prospect of a second Trump term in office will want to know, can she beat him?
It's impossible to know. I think whoever the Democratic candidate is right now starts at a deficit. If you look at all of the polling in the states that matter the most for our electoral college, the Democrats are at a disadvantage right now. But it's impossible to predict what happens when you have a brand new candidate. It could be the public looks at it and says a switcheroo is a terrible thing, and it's they didn't bargain for this. It could be that there's fresh energy pumped into Democratic voters, and independent voters like her better than Trump. You're talking about the next generation. Kamala Harris is under 60 years old compared to these two candidates, an octogenarian in Biden and someone in his late 70s in Trump. So hard to predict exactly what happens, but clearly a number of Democrats have made the determination they would rather go forward with Harris than go forward with Biden.
Just very briefly, how long do you give him? Is it days or weeks before that Joe Biden can hang on? Is it inevitable that he's going to have to stand down now, do you think?
I mean, it's up to him. He will win the Democratic nomination if he keeps moving forward, and it's based on the way our primaries work, the way our conventions work. 90+% of the delegates to the Democratic convention were elected to go to that convention based on their pledge to vote for him. So it's hard to see that changing unless he chooses to step aside. But you could see a scenario where enough Democrats come out and put pressure on him that they've basically invalidated him as a candidate, right? If the rug gets pulled out from under him. But it is up to him. If he chooses to stay on the ballot and bring his party down with him, then he can do that.
We'll have to see. Jonathan Allen, senior politics reporter for NBC News. Thank you very much for your reporting on this story. You're watching The World with me, Dominic Waghorn. Still to come, a Putin critic ill in prison. Volodymyr Zelenskyy is serving a 25-year prison sentence on treason charges and was recently transferred to hospital. I'll be joined by his wife after the break. today, China reacted furiously to an accusation at the NATO summit that it is helping maintain Russia's war effort in Ukraine. And that anger was mirrored in Moscow. A former Russian president said Russia should ensure that irreversible path of Ukraine to NATO ends either with the disappearance of Ukraine or NATO, or better still, both. Our Moscow correspondent Ivor Bennett joins me now. Ivor, thank you for joining us from Moscow. Should we take that seriously, that threat that both are destroyed, NATO and Ukraine as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's always hard to know when it comes from Dmitry Medvedev. He was the one who made these comments. Typically spiky from him. He's the former president. He stepped into the Kremlin, remember, when Vladimir Putin had to vacate the position because of term limits. That was around a decade and a half ago. He was considered a modernizer then, but not anymore. He's kind of reinvented himself as a self-styled hawk-in-chief of Vladimir Putin, normally talking about nuclear apocalypse. As you said, today he was talking about how Russia should work towards the disappearance of both Ukraine and NATO in light of this pledge to support irreversible membership an irreversible path to membership for Ukraine. And it's that word irreversible that's proven particularly incendiary for Russia today, because they've always seen historically NATO's eastward expansion in Europe as a direct threat to Russia's security. How seriously should we take these words? I think there's always a large amount of Dmitry Medvedev playing to the gallery. Having said that, he does hold quite a senior position still within the leadership structure here. He's the deputy chairman of the powerful Security Council. So his comments are thought to indicate an element of thinking within the Kremlin. The official reaction has been more measured, but still pretty punchy. Dmitry Peskov, Vladimir Putin's spokesman, said that NATO is trying to suppress Russia. He called it an unacceptable threat to national security, this pledge for Ukrainian membership, and accused the West of not being a supporter of peace. I'm sure there are plenty of people in Washington tonight who would argue it's actually the other way around.
Ivor, we'll leave it there because we want to move on to the story of one of Vladimir Putin's most high-profile critics. And as leaders meet at the NATO summit, Russia's defiance and persistence over cracking down on Kremlin critics continues. It's been over 2 years since Vladimir Kara-Murza was arrested weeks after the invasion in Ukraine. A dual UK-Russian citizen, the 42-year-old is serving a 25-year prison sentence on trumped-up treason charges. In recent days, he was transferred to a prison hospital. I'm pleased to say that Mr. Kara-Murza's wife, Evgenia, joins me now. Thank you very much for joining us. What are you being told about your husband's condition and why he's been moved?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. We still have not been able to establish the clear reason for his movement, for his transfer to this prison hospital. But the conditions under which he's held in this so-called hospital are no better than the solitary confinement that he was serving his sentence in at the strict regime prison colony number 6 in Western Siberia, in Omsk. So basically, he is kept in solitary confinement as well. You know, when any normal person hears a word hospital, he thinks of something safe, a safe place where a person is being taken care of, where a person is being given medical care, much needed medical care. Now, my husband is being kept in a prison hospital, and the Russian penitentiary system is notorious for its torturous conditions, and prison hospitals are no better. So these are torturous conditions that he's kept in that prison hospital under, and we have yet to establish the clear reason for his transfer.
Evgeny, your husband is an extremely brave and articulate man. I interviewed him outside the Kremlin walls towards the beginning of the war. You must be very aware, of course, what has happened to other brave and articulate critics of the Kremlin. How worried are you by what is happening to your husband and the fact that he's been moved like this?
Well, as to my husband, I have been worried for his life since 2015, when he ended up in a coma with a multiple organ failure following the first assassination attack on him carried out by a team of FSB operatives, a team of assassins in the service of the Russian state. In 2017, he survived yet another assassination attack, and now he's being held by the same people who basically tried to kill him twice. So yes, of course, I'm very, very worried. But what I mean to say is that the lives of political prisoners in Russia are in constant danger on a constant basis. I just learned about yet another political prisoner, Igor Baryshnikov, who is serving a ridiculous sentence for saying no to the war launched by the Russian state against Ukraine. He's serving his sentence with a serious medical condition, basically has a tube in his stomach, and he very direly needs surgery and is being consistently denied this surgery. So his life is in constant danger as well. And this is the situation across Russia, because the number of political prisoners in Russia now is over 1,000 people. And those are people persecuted for standing up to the regime and to its atrocious crimes. And these people are being consistently labeled by the regime as spies, traitors, terrorists, extremists, today, Yulia Navalny, the widow of Alexei Navalny, who was murdered in prison just a couple of months ago, was labeled a terrorist and extremist herself.
How worried are you about your own welfare, given what is happening to Alexei Navalny's widow, as you say there?
Well, I admire Yulia's courage and I admire her resilience and her strength. And I have been doing my best to continue my husband's work since his imprisonment 2 years ago. And I will continue to do so because I believe, I share my husband's beliefs, I share his vision, and I understand that the only true guarantee of peace and stability on the continent is a democratic Russia. And I believe that the world needs to stand with those Russians who represent this vision of a democratic Russia, just like my husband, and hundreds of political prisoners in Russia, and hundreds of thousands of Russians who were forced to leave the country but continue their work of opposing the regime from outside. So I will continue my husband's work for as long as it takes, and I will call for the release of political prisoners, and I will fight for their release for as long as I can stand.
Evgeny, your husband's a dual British-Russian national. Are you getting enough help from the UK over his plight?
Well, I was very happy to read the statement just issued by Foreign Secretary Lamy. And I am very grateful to him for that. And I hope that he will continue the work of his predecessor and he will stay as convinced about the fate of Russian political prisoners and they need to fight for the release as the previous Foreign Secretary was Foreign Secretary Cameron.
Evgeny Karamirza, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, but we wish you well and your husband in his new prison hospital. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, moving on to Israel now, and the IDF have told all residents in Gaza City as it steps up its military assault in the area to move out of that city. Sky News, along with other broadcasters, are continuing to push the Israeli government for access to Gaza. Over 60 media organisations have signed a new open letter urging Israel to give reporters independent access to the Strip. Entry has been all but impossible without the permission and supervision of the IDF. Alex Rossi joins me now from Jerusalem. Alex, we've seen similar initiatives in the past. Do you think this will make a difference? And how frustrating is it for you and many of us that we can't get into Gaza and do our jobs?
Well, I think it's enormously frustrating on a personal level, but there are far bigger issues at stake here, partly documenting a war which has gone on for more than 9 months. More than 100 journalists, of course, on the Palestinian side in Gaza have been killed since the fighting began. And the letter explicitly states that the burden on them is unreasonable. You need access for international journalists. International journalists, of course, have decades of experience at news organisations in working in war zones. They know how to do it as safely as you can do. And I think there's also a wider issue, really, of democracy as well. Israel states itself, says it is a democracy. Therefore, why do you not allow free access of the press? But as you were saying, this isn't the first attempts that media organisations have made. More than 60 signatories on this letter. It's been coordinated by the Campaign for Protection of Journalists. There was another open letter in February. And actually, the Foreign Press Association here in Israel has taken the issue to the High Court, and it was rejected, and the Israeli military's point of view was upheld. Now, there were a number of reasons for that. One was the protection of the journalists themselves inside a war zone. Another reason that was cited was the fact that troop positions on the Israeli side may be given away by journalists. And then there was another consideration that you'd have Israeli personnel on the border and they would be at risk. But let's be honest, if Israel was minded to let journalists in to Gaza, I'm sure that many of those issues could be resolved and you could report on them. I'm sure viewers at home will make up their own minds as to why free access isn't being given. Now, we have, of course, put this to the government press office here in Israel and also the Israeli military, asking them for a comment. But as of the time I'm speaking to you, Dominic, there has been no response.
Yeah, and I think also, Alex, it's worth pointing out that it makes life for those journalists inside Gaza even more dangerous, doesn't it? Because they must be exhausted. We have great teams in Gaza, great journalists working for us, as do many other news organisations. They've not been able to get out of there. They've not been able to have relief to replace them. And most, as we know, when we cover wars, we can send people in, rotate in and out, and give people a chance to recover. The journalists in Gaza haven't had that opportunity. But I can also ask you, do you think the Israelis are getting a fair picture of what's happening in Gaza themselves, or are they just getting a very sanitised version of what the Israeli officials and government are allowing them to see?
Well, I mean, I think it's, it's a very, very good question. I mean, I don't think anybody really is getting a very clear view of exactly what is going on inside Gaza. As you were saying, the kind of burden of documenting the war has fallen to Palestinian journalists inside Gaza. More than 100 of those have been killed so far. And you've got to, the context of that is that they're not only reporting on this war, they're also living through it as well. In many cases, their family members have been killed and their homes have been destroyed. In terms of the Israeli public, what they are seeing, I mean, I think, the focus here very much is on support for the IDF and support for getting the hostages out. The pain and suffering inside Gaza, terrible as it is perhaps secondary in light of what happened on October the 7th. I mean, that's certainly from the Israeli perspective. But we will wait and see, of course, if this letter does do any good. But I suspect that it won't have an enormous effect on access being opened up to journalists from international media.
We'll have to see, Alex. Thank you very much for that update from Washington. Well, next we can bring you an update on a young Gazan, Julia Abu Zaita, a Palestinian girl who had been living in the enclave with a rare neurological condition called AHC. Living through a war zone with her loved ones in Rafah, a family in the US has been helping them get on a medical flight to Abu Dhabi. Those who helped her, Nina and Simon from Washington, D.C., have their own little girl who suffers from the disease. They have previously told our correspondent Mark Stone that they managed to coordinate with the right people to get the medication into Gaza for Julia and have been in constant communication with the family. Julia finally arrived in the UAE a few days ago. She travelled in an ambulance convoy through Gaza and crossed into Israel. Her teenage aunt was the only family member who was granted permission to accompany her. Her parents were denied passage out by Israel. Julia and her aunt then made their way into Egypt before embarking on a government plane to the UAE. She is now receiving life-saving treatments. Only about 1,000 people worldwide have been diagnosed with this very rare neurological disorder. And with more now, we're joined by Tarek, a medical student in the US who helps injured Palestinian children get out of Gaza. Tarek Hailet, you've done so much to get Julia, but many others out of Gaza. First of all, give us an update on Julia's condition.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me. Obviously, Julia's condition has been extremely difficult from the very beginning, while she was inside Gaza, and even currently pulling her out to Egypt, and as she's stating, she's staying currently in the UAE. What's extremely upsetting about the situation is obviously the fact that they're already living in a very difficult situation inside of Gaza. The stress of possible war, on top of that, you have the unknown of being able to be taken out or not. Just like your field correspondent who was just talking about international media not being able to be brought in or brought out. This is something that we struggle with sick children, not even knowing whether they can be taken out or brought in. And so this is one of those difficult situations. But currently, thankfully, she's been getting excellent care in the UAE, and it makes us extremely, extremely happy.
It's very hard to imagine what it must be like for her parents stuck in Gaza while she's in a hospital in the UAE and obviously, suffering from complications from this very rare neurological disorder. Did the Israelis give any indication as to why she could get out, but her parents had to stay in Gaza and could not travel with her?
No. That's actually a great question. And no, they did not. And we've tried to push very hard to understand what are the protocols, what are the guidelines that are set by the Israelis on why a particular person can or cannot be taken out. And to this day, we don't know. And we've tried our hardest to kind of understand so that we can better prepare for future families. But we have not heard anything as far as to why a particular child is accepted and a particular child is not accepted, and why the parents are accepted or not accepted.
I mean, she has a very rare condition, but I think you've been trying to get many children out of Gaza. How many have you got out, and how many more do you think need to be got out for vital treatment?
Yeah, thankfully, we've pulled out hundreds of children outside of Gaza. And outside of Egypt, we've pulled out 100 children to receive medical care to various countries in Europe, in the United States, UAE, Qatar, et cetera, et cetera. But it's not enough. It's just a drop in the bucket. There's thousands and thousands of children that are inside Gaza that desperately need help. They need the Rafah border to be open again. And we stress as much as possible for the Israeli military to open up the Rafah border so that these thousands of children can receive the same fair chance that Julie was able to get.
Just briefly, give us an idea. What is it like for you? How frustrating, how difficult, tantalising, I guess, is it that you can get some kids out, but some you can't get out?
I can't even describe it to you, honestly. If you were to listen to my phone right now and you would listen to the families screaming and crying, asking for help to be taken outside of Gaza, telling me, why is this child out? I see your guys' Instagram. We see PCRF, an organization that has pulled out the most amount of children outside of Gaza. Why are we not that particular child? And I can't tell them why. I can't at all.
Tarek highlight. Thank you very much. Tarek there in Cairo, done a huge amount of work getting children out of Gaza for treatment around the world, in the UAE, in Egypt and other countries, and trying to do more so, trying to get children out also to Britain. But so far, Britain's not let many children, if any at all, out of Gaza to come here for treatment. Well, that is it for The World with me, Dominic Waghorn, for tonight. Stay tuned for news at 10 and that news conference by President Biden at the UK summit at 11:30 tonight.